That night, I opened Google Maps just out of curiosity and looked at my own house. But what I saw was enough to make me realize that moment was the biggest mistake of my life. Because in the image, it wasn't just my house. There was someone looking at me from the window, and the most terrifying part was that I knew very well that person shouldn't have been there. My name is Daniel. I'm 28 years old, and I live alone in a quiet neighborhood a bit far from the city. My life was quite simple and routine. I'd go to work in the morning, return home in the evening, sometimes watch a movie, and sometimes spend time on my phone. In other words, an ordinary life, an ordinary house, and ordinary days. At least until that night, because after that night, neither my house nor I remained the same. I had rented the house about 3 months ago. It was an old structure, but it was cheap and, most importantly, quiet. There weren't many neighbors around, which gave me the solitude I wanted. At first, this silence was peaceful, but as time passed, it turned into something else. A strange void began to form that made it feel as if I wasn't the only one living in the house, and I kept ignoring it. Until that night. It all started in a very ordinary way. I had come home early from work that evening and didn't have much to do. I ate a little, then lay down on the bed and started browsing on my phone. While scrolling through social media, it suddenly occurred to me I hadn't checked my house on Google Maps in a long time. Maybe it was a silly habit, but sometimes a person wants to see where they live from the outside. So I did just that. I opened the app and typed in my address. Within a few seconds, the map loaded and my house appeared on the screen. Everything looked normal: the roof, the garden, the small road in front, all as I knew it. But then I zoomed in a bit, and at that moment, something caught my attention. At first, I couldn't quite understand it because it was a very small detail, but my eyes got stuck there, on the window of the front facade. I moved closer to the screen, zoomed in with my fingers, and a strange feeling washed over me because there was something behind the window. At first, I thought it was just a light reflection, maybe a shadow on the glass or a glitch in the image. But after looking for a few seconds, I realized it wasn't like that because that thing was taking shape, becoming clearer, and finally, I reached a point where I couldn't deny what I saw. It was a person, a human silhouette standing right behind the window. My heart started beating a bit faster then, but I was still trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe the photo was old, maybe it was taken before I moved in and the previous tenant was inside. This was the most logical explanation, and I tried to convince myself of it. But something bothered me. The person in the image wasn't just standing there. They seemed to be looking directly at the camera. No matter how much I tried to suppress this feeling, a voice inside me was saying this wasn't normal. I pulled the phone away a bit and looked again, then zoomed back in. I squinted my eyes trying to pick out the details, and that's when I noticed it. That silhouette was completely motionless, but its posture was strange. The shoulders were a bit too low, the head was slightly tilted to the side, and the most disturbing part was that the face couldn't be discerned, as if there was only darkness where the face should be, as if light couldn't reach that spot. I stared at the screen for a while, not knowing what to do. Then instinctively, I lifted my head and looked at my room like a reflex, because for a moment I thought that image might not just be on the phone but could be reflected in the real world. But my room was completely normal. The door was closed, the window was dark, and there was no one else inside but me. I looked at the phone again, and at that moment a weight sank into my stomach, because that thing was no longer just standing at the window. It had moved a little closer, as if it had come right up behind the glass, and this time, I was sure it was looking at me. As I continued to hold the phone in my hand, I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. Because even if a person thinks what they see isn't real, they sometimes can't pull away. On the contrary, they want to look more, to try and understand more. And that's exactly what I was doing, trying to decipher that thing behind the window. But no matter how much I looked, my unease only increased. Because that silhouette no longer looked like just a shape, its presence had become more distinct. And the strangest thing was this: the image was static. Normally, a photo on Google Maps doesn't move, but the position of that figure seemed to have changed. This shouldn't have been possible, but I was seeing it with my own eyes. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of my mind. that maybe the combination of light and shadow made it seem like it was moving, or maybe my brain was filling in missing details. These things happen, especially in dark environments where human perception changes. But that feeling inside me, that cold, heavy feeling, told me it wasn't so. With that thought, I slowly turned my head and looked at the window in real life. The room was dark. Only the light from the phone illuminated my face, and the window was completely black. It was impossible to see outside, but there should have been a reflection from the inside. Even so, I couldn't see anything there. No movement, no shadow, nothing. And this should have actually relieved me, but the opposite happened because another possibility came to mind. What if that thing wasn't outside? My heart suddenly began to beat faster, and I looked at the phone again, this time more carefully, more focused. And what I realized then turned my entire body ice cold, because that dark face behind the window was looking at me. I was sure of it. I couldn't make out the eyes, but the sensation of being watched was very clear, as if it were standing on the other side of the glass, watching me. This couldn't just be an image. It shouldn't be a photograph, because something that felt this alive couldn't be static. I wanted to turn off the screen, but my fingers wouldn't move, as if something had locked me there. I couldn't break away from that image, and a few seconds later, involuntarily, I zoomed in again. I brought it even closer, and doing this was one of the worst decisions of my life because this time, I began to see the details, not just the silhouette. The head of the thing standing behind the glass was slightly tilted. Its neck was a bit longer than normal, and its shoulders weren't like a human's. They were lower than they should be. But the truly terrifying part was the face. There was still no clear face there, but two even darker spots could be discerned within the darkness. And at that moment, I realized they were eyes that didn't reflect light, appearing like voids. And those eyes were looking directly at me. With a reflex, I pulled the phone away from my face a bit and took a deep breath. But this changed nothing because the feeling inside me had now gone beyond fear. It was a feeling of being threatened, something I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. And just then the thought that occurred to me stopped me completely. If this image was truly old, if this was just a photograph from the past, then where should that thing be right now? I slowly turned my head back to the window. I looked into the darkness. There was nothing there, but that absence wasn't normal, as if something wasn't where it should be. And as this feeling settled inside me, I looked at the phone again. And at that moment, my breath hitched, because that thing was no longer behind the window. The glass was empty, completely empty, but this didn't comfort me, because then only one possibility remained. It was no longer inside, and if it wasn't inside, then it was outside. While holding the phone, that pressure inside me was gradually increasing, because what I had just seen defied logic, and even worse, its disappearance was driving me into a greater fear rather than relieving me. Sometimes a person isn't afraid of what they see, but of what they can no longer see. And at that moment, that was exactly what I felt, because I no longer knew where that thing was. I remained motionless for a while, my eyes darting between the phone and the window, as if there were a connection between the two, as if one were a reflection of the other. As this thought occurred to me, a strange discomfort formed within me, because if this were true, if that image wasn't just a recording but was somehow connected to the present, then I hadn't just looked at a photograph a moment ago. I immediately pulled back the view on Google Maps and checked again. I examined the surroundings, the street, the neighboring houses. Everything looked normal, the cars, the trees, the road. None had anything abnormal. But at the point where my house was, the feeling of strangeness sinking into me wouldn't go away, because now I knew. What I saw in that image wasn't just a detail. It was like a warning, and I had realized it too late. At that moment, the thought that occurred to me was very simple but equally disturbing. If that thing wasn't behind the window and wasn't inside, then it must be somewhere outside the house. Maybe in the garden, maybe in front of the door, or maybe even closer. With this thought, I instinctively stood up. My heart was racing, but curiosity was outweighing the fear. I slowly walked towards the room's door and stopped for a moment before opening it. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound. There was nothing. This silence should have given me confidence, but it didn't, because this silence wasn't normal. It was too clean, too flat, as if something were specifically maintaining this silence. A few seconds later, I slowly opened the door. The hinges made a slight sound, but even that seemed so loud that my heart felt like it would leap out of my chest. I cracked the door open and looked into the hallway. The hallway was dark, as always, but this time it felt different, as if it were a bit longer, a bit deeper, a bit emptier. I turned on my phone's flashlight and slowly pointed the light down the hallway. The light traveled across the wooden floor, hit the walls, and reached the corners, but there was no movement. No shadow stirred. Everything was as it should be, yet the feeling inside me wouldn't pass, because now the issue wasn't the things I saw, but the thing I couldn't feel but knew existed. I stepped into the hallway with slow strides. With every step, the floorboards creaked slightly, and these were sounds I was normally used to, but that night, each one seemed too distinct, too sharp, as if every part of the house were listening to me. As I moved through that silence, I instinctively turned my head towards the front door. The door was closed, but a slight shadow was seeping from under it. I froze. This wasn't normal because there was no light outside. There was no lamp in front of the door, and the street light wouldn't hit from that angle. So, that shadow wasn't coming from the outside. The moment this thought settled in my mind, my heart raced and I instinctively took a step back, but I couldn't take my eyes off the door. That thin line of darkness, that shadow seeping in from under the door, was motionless, but its presence was terrifying enough. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then that shadow moved just a little. As if something were standing in front of the door and shifting its weight, I held my breath. I could hear nothing but my own heartbeat in my ears, and right at that moment, there were 3 knocks on the door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was so clear that I didn't even need to think. That thing was no longer just an image I saw on the phone. It was really here now, on the other side of my front door, waiting for me. I pulled back as a reflex, but my eyes were still on the door because for a moment, I felt a desire to open it. I don't know why, but a strange urge formed inside me, as if everything would be clarified if I opened it. But at the same time, another voice was telling me that this would be the biggest mistake I could ever make. Knock, knock, knock. Again, in the same way, slow, regular, patient. This was no coincidence. This was a call. And the most terrifying thing was, I knew exactly who it was calling for. As I looked at the door, I felt time slowing down. Because the silence that followed those 3 knocks wasn't an ordinary silence. It was as if something were waiting for an answer patiently, without rushing, watching what I would do. This feeling tightened inside me even more because I realized this situation was now completely under my control. If I opened the door, everything would change. If I didn't know what would happen. I slowly stepped back without taking my eyes off the door, trying to suppress that strange urge because no matter how strong it was, I knew it wasn't right. This wasn't just curiosity. It was as if something were trying to guide me, and I couldn't allow that. My phone was still in my hand and the screen had remained on. I instinctively looked at Google Maps again, thinking maybe I could still see something. Maybe there was an explanation for this situation. But what I saw completely broke my heart's rhythm because that image was no longer as it was before. The house was still there, the garden, the road, everything was the same, but the window wasn't empty. That thing had returned, but this time it was different. It was no longer just standing behind the glass. Its face was almost pressed against it. The dark face was closer, more distinct, and those 2 void-like eye spots were now much more clearly discernible. As if the darkness within it were about to spill out. I involuntarily pulled back. The phone was shaking in my hand because what I realized at that moment froze my entire body. That thing wasn't just looking at me. It was smiling. I couldn't make out a full mouth, but the dark shape on its face had changed, as if there were a distortion that wasn't a human facial expression but was somehow perceived as a smile. This image broke something in my brain because this was no longer just a silhouette. It was a being, and it was watching me. There was another knock at the door, harder this time, faster. Knock, knock, knock. I tore my eyes away from the phone and turned them to the door because it couldn't be a coincidence that these 2 things were happening at the same time. There was a connection between what I saw on my phone and the thing behind the door, and I was right in the middle of it. My breathing had quickened, my hands had gone cold, but still, I couldn't move because fear sometimes forces a person to freeze in place rather than flee. The shadow under the door was more distinct this time, thicker, as if the thing standing in front of the door had moved even closer. Then, the door handle moved slightly. At that moment, something inside me snapped. This was no longer about waiting or trying to understand. This was a direct threat. I reflexively took a few steps back. My back hit the wall, but my eyes were still on the door because the handle slowly went down, very slowly, as if the thing on the other side were in no hurry, keeping everything under control. And at that moment I understood, this thing wasn't trying to force its way in. It was waiting for me to open it, but something went wrong. The door didn't open, the handle went back up, and everything stopped all at once. Silence returned. But this time it was different, heavier, more menacing. Slowly, I looked at the phone again, involuntarily, because I no longer wanted to look at that screen, but I couldn't stop myself. And what I saw then became an image I will never forget in my life. The window was empty, but this time there was something different. The image had changed. The camera angle was the same, but the front door of the house was now visible, and someone was standing in front of the door, head slightly tilted, shoulders low, motionless, right in front of my door. So this proved that what I saw wasn't just a recording. This was happening now. As my heart beat as if to tear through my chest, I looked at the actual door again. And at that moment, I made the biggest mistake. I took a step forward, as if something invisible were pulling me, as if I had to open that door. I slowly reached my hand towards the door handle. My fingers were trembling, but I didn't stop. That voice inside me was now stronger. Look, finish it. Right at the moment I touched the door handle, a sound came from my phone, a notification. I looked at the screen. It was from Google Maps, a new update, a new image, and at that moment I understood. As I approached the door, that thing had approached me. I opened the new image on the phone screen. My heart nearly stopped because this was no longer just a photo or a video. It was a warning, a sign. Looking at it, I realized that thing was following my movements. The image on Google Maps no longer just showed the exterior of the house. The camera angle had changed according to my perspective, and the figure standing in front of the door was much closer, as if it were about to touch the door in a few seconds. Its eyes were still that void-like darkness, its face still not quite human, but its presence was very vivid. At that moment, all I could do was hold my breath. With every movement, my heart was piercing my chest. I stood up, still holding the phone in my hand, but I no longer dared to take a step. Because that thing wasn't just standing at the door. It felt as if it had entered the house, as if every corner, every wall, every shadow were under its control. And I finally realized, this wasn't just my house. It was a violation of my safe space, and every second, every breath was allowing it to get closer. In a moment of courage, I decided to open the door. My hand touched the handle, but I stopped reflexively because something was whispering to me that if I did this, there would be no turning back. And at that moment, I realized the only reason I stopped before opening the door was realizing it wasn't already inside. I looked at the phone screen once more. The thing standing in front of the door in the image had suddenly vanished, but I remained frozen because my eyes could still feel it. Those cold, empty gazes were still in my mind. At that moment, I understood that this wasn't just a sign, this wasn't a game. This was real, and that thing was still here, waiting, patient, ruthless. Holding my breath, I stepped back and closed the door. My whole body was shaking. My heart was still pounding as if to tear through my chest, but I also felt a strange sense of relief because I now knew what to do. I could plan what to do next because what I saw was no longer just an image. It was a presence, and I realized I could track it. I knew I would never forget that night, that house, that window, that silhouette. Were no longer just a memory, it was a reality. And from now on, I would feel its eyes on me always, everywhere. Here is the silence of a true fear. At that moment, I understood that wanting to see some things can be dangerous. Not everything you see on a phone screen may be real, but some things find you, even if you don't realize it. See you in the next story, and remember, true fear is often not in front of your eyes, but hidden in what you feel.